right. Week 8 in the first quarter Cornerstone study of the year. We have been talking about Christ's dual nature as depicted in John's gospel, right? So we've hit what John depicts as sort of you might consider this the apex of Jesus' earthly ministry. Because from here on out, it's full speed ahead to the cross. But before that, Lazarus. This is the last sign that he gives before he lays down his life. And this landmark event displays both his humanity and his deity intermingled as he gives full proof of both his love and his power over even death and decay. But to begin, I'd like to tell you a story, a little bit of historical fiction. Once upon a time, there were 3 siblings, a brother and 2 sisters. The brother was a well-to-do man, and we're not told if the sisters ever married. Martha, you can kind of see she, Mary, probably not. Martha, I see her as the oldest sister. She's the responsible, the practical one. Mary, she seems a little indulged, maybe, just the very emotional, but she gives her whole heart to everything she does. And these 3 siblings, they had a friend, a very famous friend. You've heard his name, Jesus of Nazareth, and he would come and stay with them when he was in their area. Well, it happened one day that the brother, he got very ill. And you do what you can, and it doesn't work. And it hit the point where the sisters were so worried about him that they did something they probably wouldn't normally do. They send a message to Jesus. And it's not a request, but the request is in it. You can hear the request in the heart when they ask him, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Because they know he's a good friend. So they send out a messenger with this message. And they've heard that Jesus has gone out into the sort of the wilderness area on the other side of the Jordan. So the messenger probably has his work cut out for him to find Jesus right off. But they hope. And they wait. And while they wait, their big brother keeps getting worse. And you can almost hear them as they take care of him. If only Jesus can get here in time. If only he can get here in time, it'll be okay. Maybe even they lost track of how many times they said that to each other as they watched their brother get worse, decline, until not 2 days after they send the messenger out, he dies. Now, Martha, you can easily suppose, one of her first reactions would have been all the things that need to be done. We have to wash the body. We have to prepare the body. We have to arrange to hire the flute players and the professional mourners. And he's got a standing in the community. He's well-to-do, so it won't do to skimp on these things. But Mary, you can almost just see her break down, just crying and crying. And all she can do is cry, pouring out her heart. But the neighbors are kind. They come in and they help, and they're supporting, and people come from a long way off. Lazarus had a standing. He was a well-to-do man. So people are coming from all over the place. They're coming to support. Now Mary has people to look after her. Martha doesn't have to try to keep an eye on her so much to see that she's not overdoing it. And, you can almost see Martha, even if they won't let her do anything in the kitchen, that's still where she's most comfortable. So just sitting in the kitchen, taking in all the condolences and all the sympathy, and thinking to herself, if only Jesus had got here in time. If only. And 2 days after the death, the messenger comes back, and he doesn't need to be told what happened. He knows the signs of a funeral. But he has a message. He said Jesus sent him back to say, this illness does not lead to death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And they look at each other and they think, well, he had no way to know. But it's the first time he's really been wrong. And, they probably both shook their heads and are like, but he cared. But he's not here. Why isn't he here? Scripture doesn't tell us what happened in those days. I'm just, cursed with an overactive imagination. But what we do know happened during those days is not on Mary and Martha's side. What we do know happened was on Jesus' side. And John tells us Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. It's that agape love. The love that seeks the good without asking anything in return. And it's curious, the scripture says he loved them, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. I don't think this is because the messenger failed to make clear how urgent the situation was. I think it's because he knew that it was better for them to go through this. Which is weird to us because we think of love as protecting people from ever having to go through bad things, making sure nothing touches them. Jesus' love is a little different. So it took the messenger 2 days to get there. And Jesus stays 2 days longer. So that means he's got another 2 days journey to get to Bethany. That's 4 days. This will come in as a very key detail. So when he decides it's time to go after 2 days, he says to his disciples, well, let's go back to Judea. And they're like, are you out of your mind, Rabbi? Nothing quite that blunt, much more respectful. The Jews were seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? That's very polite speak for, are you nuts? This is a bad idea. But Jesus has an interesting response to them. To their concern, he says, are there not 12 hours in the day? This was your common work day. It was divided up into 12 hours. Weirdly enough, in the winter, there were 12 short hours, and in the summer, there were 12 long hours, but there were still only ever 12 hours in the day. And they're like, well, yes, there are. If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. This is not an answer, is what I imagine the disciples are saying. But it reminds me of something else. If you go back to John chapter 9, starting in verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Right. So when we go back and we see, if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. You get the feeling that he's saying we must do the works of him who sent us while I am still here. And that brings us back to John's recurring theme of his hour. He will go not because he is defying the danger, but because he knows he's on God's schedule. And while he is still the light of the world, meaning while he is still in this world, he does the work, and no one can stop him. As if this wasn't confusing enough to them, after saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." So they've come out of this rather obscure metaphorical comment to Lazarus has fallen asleep. And of course, their first thought is, well, if he's sleeping, he'll get better. Jesus had spoken of him as dying. They thought, right, just taking rest, which, of course, if you are resting after an illness, you will get better. But Jesus is like, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. This ties in with before, when it says he loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, so he delayed. Because it was better this way. And of course, to them, that is bewildering. How can this possibly be better? They'll find out. So this is all before he gets to Bethany. And Thomas, we give Thomas a hard time because of his most famous saying, unless I see the wounds, put my hand out and touch them, I won't believe. So he gets labeled Doubting Thomas. But listen just how diehard he is when he says, let's also go with him that we may die with him. It's like, all right, we're doing this. It's not going to end well, but we're doing it. So on that note, they start back to Bethany. Not even 2 miles away from Jerusalem, where there had been repeated attempts to arrest him and an ongoing conspiracy to murder him. And from Jerusalem, it says many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So Jesus is headed toward this group, and he stops on the outskirts of town, and somebody comes in and tells Martha that he's on his way. So she gets up and goes out to meet him. Somehow she manages it so nobody follows her. And her first words to Jesus are what I can't help but imagine she and Mary had been saying to one another for 4 days. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But she follows up with a remarkable combination of statements. Even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. I'm not sure what she had in mind when she said that. Because when Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again, she's like, well, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Because, if you were on the Pharisee side of theology, you did believe in a resurrection of the just. But Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? This is a hard question, because to say something as sweeping as I am resurrection, I am life, is not what a purely human could say. No matter how skilled a physician, they still lose patience. People still die. And yet this man says, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. But Martha looks at him and says, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Peter gets a lot of credit for that. Who do you say I am? You are the Christ. But I think Martha should get a lot more credit for this. Because I can, from previous accounts, she was more comfortable in the kitchen. She didn't spend a lot of time sitting at Jesus' feet, not like her sister. She kind of ignored all the housekeeping and just sat and listened. But somehow, even while just going in and out, taking care of the hospitality needs of the group, she had learned enough and had come to believe enough to say, you are the Christ, the Son of God. So after she comes to this point, she has some trust in him. She says has professed this great profession. So she goes and she calls for her sister and whispers to her, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And Mary, this is kind of how I get the feeling that she's not really the circumspect type of person. Whatever she does flat out and wholehearted, and she bolts and goes to meet him, and everybody notices. So the Jews who had come to gather around her to console her, they see her going. They're like, oh, she must be going out to the tomb to weep. We can't let her go alone. And so they go out with her. And so here's this crowd of Jerusalem-based Jews coming out, and there's Jesus. And Mary, right, falls at his feet, and she only makes it through that sentence, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. And she is just bawling. She is just crying her heart out. And the Jews who come with her, they're also crying. This is that sort of wailing. We don't get a lot of it in Minnesota. We're not really culturally attuned to that kind of mourning, but the outcry must have been considerable. And Jesus looks at this, and two things happen within him. English doesn't really convey it very clearly, but it says he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. The second one, greatly troubled, is that sort of grip of compassion that he feels when he sees people in need. But the first part, deeply moved in spirit, the Greek actually is more like, if you take it literally, it's like snorting like an angry horse. It's this sort of indignation, this outrage. And people think, well, why would he be so outraged at the sight of these people mourning? And, there's a lot of speculation about it, but a lot of people, they come to a couple different, sort of a mixed conclusion between two things. The first being anger at death itself and what it does to people, not just to the person who died, but to the people who loved that person. But there's also the idea, because it says he looked at Mary and the Jews weeping, and that there was some anger there at what one commentator called worldly grief, the grief that has no hope. Now, you remember when Martha came to him, she said, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And then she follows up with, but I know that whatever you ask from God, he'll give you. And I believe that you are the Christ. Now, remember, Mary, she can't even make it that far. She is absolutely overcome. And Jesus is very upset. But he doesn't scold. He just says, where have you laid him? And they say, come and see. And he also wept. The word for this is just a quiet shedding of tears. He is not immune from human emotion. These are people he cares about deeply. And I don't think it's a great stretch to say he hates to see them so grieved. And the commentary from the, you might say, the outsiders, the mourners who have come in, are A, see how he loved him, and B, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? So you have from three sides, he's getting, if you had only been here, if you had only been here, could you not, if you were this powerful, have kept this man from dying? Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. Now we have a little bit of a sketch of the scene here, that there was a cave carved out and a stone pushed up against the door. Now remember, how long has it been since Lazarus died? 4 days. So when he says, take away the stone, Mary, the practical sister, recoils. This is that bit in the King James where she saith to Jesus, Lord, he stinketh. Because it's like he's been in there for 4 days dead. These people knew what happened to a 4-day-old corpse. If you think about it, what we have from the burial of Jesus, when they prepared his body, this is, you're skipping ahead to chapter 19, where Joseph of Arimathea asks for the body, has it taken down, and then Nicodemus, he brings a mixture of myrrh and aloes, so some spices, some ointments and whatnot, about 75 pounds in weight. Why would you need, and if you think about it, if you've ever carried 2 bags of softener salt, around about that amount of myrrh and aloe ointments, why would you need that? It's not to preserve the body, but to combat the smell. And they were going to bring more spices after the Sabbath. So here we have Jesus saying, take away the stone of this 4-day-old burial. And Martha's like, Are you sure? And he looks at her, and all he says is, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? No more argument. They take away the stone. So Jesus lifts up his eyes to the heaven and he prays. A rather odd sort of prayer. But first he thanks God. He says, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. Well, I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around. It's like he's having a conversation that's meant to be overheard. Why is he doing this? That they may believe that the Father sent him. All right, so here's the setup, right? Cave, stone moved, Jesus prays, and then he cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. He's like, you get out here. And this is the part that cracks me up the most, because when they prepare the body, they wrap it in cloths, and then they smother it in possibly 80 pounds of stuff. So what's going to come out of this cave? And, it says the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips. And so you're saying, okay, so he's all wound up with linen. Is he hopping? Is he doing one of those little, like, when you forget to clip the thing between your shoes kind of shuffles? We don't know. But we know he is quite a sight. His head is still wrapped, and Jesus is like, unwrap him and let him go. And I find it interesting that John leaves out the reaction. Lazarus, I'm sure, is kind of confused. But think about this, too. 4 days dead. Apparently, around that time, there was a sort of a folklore that the spirit of the dead person lingered around the body for maybe 3 days until it saw the decay begin to set in and lost all hope of re-entering the body. And it's one thing to bring the soul back to the body, but Lazarus not only came to life, but all the decay of death was reversed. The illness that killed him wiped away. And basically, I think all he really needed was a good bath and a fresh, clean set of clothes. And if you thought that the commotion was loud when they were mourning, think about what it must have been when they were rejoicing. And it said many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed him. But some of them went back to Jerusalem to tell on him to the Pharisees. So the reactions to this are, the family was happy. Friends of the family were happy. But some people just are never happy. And the Pharisees, the council, their reaction is, what are we going to do with this man? He performs many signs, and if we let him go on like this, if you let him, well, funny thing to say about a man who was sent by God, but if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Real irony is that they killed Jesus to try and make sure that the Romans didn't come in and destroy their temple and scatter their population amongst the nations. But yeah. Caiaphas, who was the high priest, makes an interesting prophecy. It's another one of those instances where God can speak through even, well, I mean, in the Old Testament, we saw he could even speak through the mouth of a donkey, but even through one of his enemies, he can speak. Because Caiaphas prophesied that this man should die for the people, not only the nation, but to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And that was why Jesus came, to lay down his life to save the children of God. But it wasn't in the way they thought. So we're left with this atmosphere of pre-Passover tension where people are watching for him, saying, is he going to come? Is he not going to come? If he comes, you better tell us so we can arrest him. And in this atmosphere, before the Passover, Jesus comes back to Bethany. And they have a dinner party. And Mary shows her wholehearted, unstinting, her I can't even really think of a good word for it, but her extravagance of emotion. Because at the dinner party, she takes and she breaks this bottle. It was one of those where you could only open it by breaking the cap off the neck of the bottle to pour out what was about 12 ounces. So, a cup and a half, not quite a pint, the Roman pint, of what they call pure nard, which would have been myrrh. Coincident or not, one of the chief ointments for preparing a body for burial. And she anoints his feet. She pours it on his head. She wipes her feet with his hair. She is not caring what anybody thinks. She is expressing an extravagant worship. Like I said, some people are never happy. Other gospels say the disciples scolded her for this, but John puts the words in the mouth of Judas himself, he who was about to betray Jesus. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Which is a lovely thing to say if you're concerned for the poor, but John puts in a side note that Judas said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. You get the feeling that even at this, this is like long after the events, John was quite an old man, probably, by the time he wrote this gospel, but there are some things that remain vivid throughout your life. And for John, Judas was one of them. So this protest is made, and Jesus slaps it down. He says, leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. And of course, his presence in Bethany does not go unnoticed. A large crowd of Jews learned that Jesus was there, and they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, who must have been quite the spectacle. Did you hear about this guy? Have you met my friend Lazarus? He was dead for 4 days. Jesus raised him from the dead. And so, not to lack any opportunity of stamping this out, the chief priests decide they're going to kill Lazarus too. He's just too good of evidence. Poor thing. He's already died once, and he's going to have to die again, but at least leave him some time. Anyway, so this is how John brings Jesus' earthly ministry up to this great apex of power over death and decay, and now we're in it. We're really in it. Because the next thing we come to next week, triumphal entry, the last week.